This is what we've decided to give you. It's not worth much. It's lovely. Something to remember us by.
This is what we've decided to give you. Margaret Holt set the small velvet box on the kitchen table the way you set something down when you want the gesture to look generous without feeling it. The box was old, the velvet worn at the corners, the hinge stiff. It had been in the house for decades, in a drawer in the study that nobody opened anymore. "It belonged to my mother-in-law," Margaret said. "It's not worth much. The setting is outdated, but we thought, given your years with us, it seemed fitting." The woman across the table opened the box. Inside was a ring, gold band thinned with age. A center stone that looked like glass, cloudy, unremarkable, the kind of stone that sits in an old setting and asks nothing of you. "It's lovely," the woman said. "It's been in storage for years. Nobody wears it. You've been here since Thomas was 3 years old. We thought you'd want something to remember us by." The woman looked at the ring. She was 61 years old. She had worked in the Holt household for 22 years, had cooked their meals, cared for their children, been present for every illness and celebration and quiet Tuesday morning. She had received for 22 years a salary that had been adjusted once in 2011 and had not been adjusted since. She took the ring out of the box. She placed it on her right hand. She looked at it for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she said most things, without performance, without residue. She meant it exactly as much as the situation warranted, and not 1 degree more. Margaret Holt smiled the smile of a woman who had just discharged an obligation and felt good about the discharge. And in 11 days, in a jeweler's shop on the east side of the city, that ring would be placed under a loupe by a man named Philip Ose, who had spent 34 years looking at stones. And what he saw would change everything anyone in that house had assumed about what had been given and to whom. Stay with this story. Subscribe, because what Philip Osai saw under that loupe is not what Margaret Holt thought she was giving away. And the truth of it is going to arrive in a way that nobody in the Holt household was prepared for. But to understand that moment, you have to understand the woman who wore the ring home, not what the Holts saw when they looked at her, what she actually was. The Holt family had lived in the same house in Savannah, Georgia for 3 generations. The house was a federal-style property on a street of federal-style properties, the kind of address that communicated to people who understood such communications, a specific and durable kind of standing. The current generation, Margaret, her husband Charles, and their 2 adult children, occupied it with the ease of people who had never needed to think about whether they belonged somewhere. Charles Holt ran an investment management firm that his father had started and that he had grown, competently if not brilliantly, into something that sustained the family's lifestyle and their position without requiring anyone to examine either too closely. Margaret managed the household, the social calendar, and the particular work of maintaining the Holt family's presentation to the world, which was considerable and ongoing, and which she approached with the organized efficiency of a woman who understood that appearances were not superficial but structural, the framework within which everything else operated. She was not a cruel woman. This was important to understand. She was not someone who made a deliberate choice to diminish the people who worked for her. She simply did not see them, in the way that people do not see the furniture that has always been there, not with hostility but with the specific, comfortable blindness of someone who has never needed to look. The woman she had just given the ring to was named Adiz Miriam Osai. She had been born in Accra, Ghana, in 1962. She had come to the United States in 1989 at 27. With a degree in economics from the University of Ghana and a husband named Philip, who had a degree in gemology from the same institution, and who had, in the years since their arrival, built a small but respected jewelry evaluation practice in Savannah's historic district. What the Holt family had never known, what they had never asked, and therefore had never learned, was that the woman who had cooked their meals and cared for their children for 22 years had a degree in economics. That she had worked in the Holt household not because it was all she could do, but because it had been, in the specific circumstances of her family's first years in America, the work that was available and that paid reliably, and that could be done on a schedule that allowed her to be present for her own children. What they had also never known was that her husband evaluated gemstones for a living, that his shop was on Montgomery Street, 12 minutes from their house, that he had spent 34 years looking at stones and could tell you, with a precision that required no instrument, what a stone was before he even reached for the loop. They had never asked. She had never told them. She had worked in their house for 22 years and they had not thought to ask, and she had not thought it was her obligation to offer, and the gap between those two facts had been, for 22 years, simply the shape of the relationship. Her name, when she was a child in Accra, had been Adiz, the king's daughter in Igbo, which was her maternal grandmother's language. Though Adiz had grown up in Ghana and thought of herself as Ghanaian, and had kept the name because her grandmother had given it to her, and her grandmother had been the kind of person whose gifts you kept, she had been a precise child. Not quiet, her mother described her as the loudest thinker she had ever met, which was her mother's way of saying that Adiz's internal processes had a tendency to become external without announcement. She argued, she asked follow-up questions. She read the newspaper at breakfast and had opinions about what she read, which she expressed to her father over eggs in the way that children express opinions to fathers who have made the mistake of responding seriously to the first one. Her father was an engineer. He built things that needed to work. He had given her, through the daily example of his work, the understanding that the distance between something that almost worked and something that worked was not a matter of degree but of kind. That precision was not an add-on but the thing itself. She had applied this to economics the way she applied it to everything, completely, without shortcuts, with the specific attention of someone who understood that the numbers were telling a story, and that the story had a logic, and that following the logic was the most important thing you could do in a room full of people who were content with the surface of it. She had met Philip at the university. He was studying gemology, the science and art of evaluating precious stones, their composition, their cut, their clarity, their value. He had explained to her, early in their relationship, that what he did was not about the stones themselves, but about the truth of them, that a stone's value was not in its appearance but in its actual properties, and that those properties could be obscured by setting, by surface, by assumption, and that his job was to see past all of that to what was actually there. She had looked at him when he said this and understood, without needing to say it, that he had just described the most important thing she had ever heard about how to look at the world. They had married in 1987. They had come to America in 1989 with 2 suitcases, their credentials, and a specific, shared understanding that the work of building something from the beginning required patience and pragmatism, and the willingness to do what needed doing while the longer project developed. Philip had taken a position at a jewelry store while he established his reputation. Adiz had taken the position at the Holt household because the Holt children were young and the pay was reliable, and the schedule allowed her to be home for her own children in the afternoons. She had intended it to be temporary. 22 years had a way of becoming permanent through accumulation rather than decision, each year extending from the last without a clear moment at which a different choice presented itself. And then the children were grown and the work was familiar and the salary, while inadequate, was consistent. And consistency had its own value when you understood the alternative. She had not been unhappy. This was the important distinction. She had not been treated cruelly. She had been treated the way furniture was treated, with the casual, unreflective comfort of people who had never needed to think about what the furniture was or where it came from. She had thought about it every day in the specific, internal way of a person who is seen as one thing and knows themselves to be another. She had not been bitter about the gap. Bitterness was not useful, and she was a practical woman. She had simply waited, with the patience of someone who understood that the truth of a thing and the perceived value of a thing were often different, and that the difference had a way of surfacing eventually if you stayed close to it long enough. And that was the thing the Holt family never saw coming. What was at stake was not, in the immediate sense, the ring. The ring was a symbol of the relationship, of what the Holts believed they had given Adiz over 22 years, and of what they believed they were giving her now. A dismissal dressed as a gift. A small velvet box containing the family's assessment of what she was worth. What was at stake was also not vengeance. Adiz was not a woman who organized her life around the redress of slights. She was 61 years old, and she had spent those years doing work that mattered to her, raising her own children, building a life with Philip, being present for the things that deserved presence, and the Holts were a chapter of that life, not the whole of it. What was at stake was simpler and more important than either of those things. It was the truth of the ring, the truth of what 22 years was worth. The truth of what the Holts had in their house, had always had and had never thought to look at. She did not know yet what the truth was. She suspected. Philip had taught her to look at stones the way he looked at them, not at what they appeared to be, but at what they actually were. And she had looked at the stone in the ring, and something in her had said, "This is not what they think it is," but she did not know. She was going to find out. She put the ring in her pocket and she walked home. 3 weeks. Philip was in the kitchen when she arrived. He was making tea, the specific ritual of it, the way he had made tea every evening for 34 years. The kettle and the cups, and the particular unhurried patience of a man who believed that the small rituals were the ones that held everything together. He looked at her when she came in. He could read her the way he read stones, not the surface, the actual thing. He had been doing it for 37 years, and he was very good at it. He said, "What happened?" She sat down at the kitchen table. She took the ring out of her pocket. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not touch it. He looked at it the way he looked at everything that came through the door of his shop, with the first assessment, which was the one before the instruments, the one that was pure observation and experience, and the accumulated knowledge of 34 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where did this come from?" She told him. He was quiet again. He picked up the ring. He held it under the kitchen light. He turned it. He looked at the stone. He set it down. "Come to the shop tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Tomorrow," he said. She nodded. They drank their tea. They talked about their children, and about the week, and about the neighbor's dog that had been barking at 3 in the morning again. They talked the way people talk when they have been talking for 37 years, and the conversation does not need to be constructed because it simply is, continuous and reliable as the kettle. She did not ask him what he had seen. He would tell her tomorrow under the proper light with the proper instruments. She trusted him to tell her what was true. He trusted himself to find it. 11 days. Philip Osa had opened his shop on Montgomery Street in 1994, 4 years after coming to America, in a space that had previously been a tailor's and that still, when the light was right, smelled faintly of fabric and old thread. He had built his reputation the same way he built everything, one accurate assessment at a time, without exaggeration, without the upward inflation that some evaluators used to make clients feel better about what they had brought in. Philip told the truth about stones. This was not as common in his field as one might hope, and it had cost him some clients early on, people who wanted to be told their grandmother's ring was worth more than it was, who went elsewhere when Philip told them the actual figure. But it had built him, over 34 years, a reputation that was worth more than the clients he had lost. The auction houses knew his name. The estate lawyers in Savannah and Charleston and Beaufort knew his name. When someone needed to know what something actually was, they came to Montgomery Street. He opened the shop at 9 the next morning. Adiz arrived at 9:15. She sat across from him at his workbench, the one with the proper light, the daylight-balanced lamp that revealed what rings looked like in the conditions under which stones were best evaluated. He put on his loupe, he picked up the ring. He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face. She had watched his face for 37 years, and she could read it the way he could read hers. Not perfectly, because no one read anyone perfectly, but well enough to know when something significant was happening inside it. Something significant was happening inside it. He set the loupe down. He reached for the refractometer, the instrument that measured a stone's refractive index, the specific way light bent through it, the number that told you, with mathematical precision, what the stone was made of. He took the measurement, he wrote it down, he looked at what he had written, he picked up the loupe again. She waited. Philip Osai did not rush conclusions. This was the first thing he had told every apprentice who had ever worked in his shop. The stone will tell you what it is if you give it the time to speak. The mistake most people make is that they decide before they look, and then they see only what confirms the decision. He looked. When he finally set the loupe down for the second time and looked at his wife, his face had the expression she associated with his most significant assessments. Not triumph, not vindication, but the specific, composed gravity of a man who has just confirmed something true and is deciding how to say it. He said, "Adiz," she said, "tell me." He said, "This stone is a diamond." She looked at the ring. "An old diamond," he said, "probably 1920s. The cut is old European, you can tell from the facet pattern, the high crown. They stopped cutting this way by the 1940s. The setting is gold, 14 karat, possibly higher." He paused. "The stone is approximately 2.5 carats. I'll need to measure precisely, but approximately." She looked at the ring on the table between them. She said, "The setting is tarnished. Platinum tarnishes differently. Gold can look different when it's been stored improperly. The cloudiness in the stone, that's a surface issue. Decades of storage without cleaning. The stone underneath is clean." She was quiet. He said, "Adiz. A 2.5 carat old European cut diamond in good condition. Do you know what that's worth?" She looked at him. He said a number. She looked at the ring for a long time. He waited. She said, "Are you certain?" He said, "I'll have it certified, third-party grading, but yes, I'm certain." She looked at her husband, at the man who had spent 34 years looking at stones and telling the truth about what he saw, at the man who had sat across from her at a kitchen table in Accra in 1985 and told her that his job was to see past appearance to what was actually there. She said, "How long will certification take?" "A week to 10 days if I send it today." She looked at the ring. She said, "Send it today. Remember the certification. It comes back." And that was the thing the Holt family never saw coming. She did not call Margaret Holt. She did not call the house. She went about her life in the 10 days that followed the same way she had gone about her life for 22 years, with the specific, undramatic patience of a woman who understood that the work of finding the truth was different from the work of responding to it, and that you completed the first before you began the second. She cooked, she read. She had her grandchildren over for Saturday lunch, which was the ritual of the week. Her daughter's 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9, who ate at her table with the same unself-conscious hunger with which her own children had eaten at this table 30 years ago. She looked at the ring on her right hand and thought about Margaret Holt setting the velvet box on the kitchen table, about the way she had said it's not worth much with the specific confidence of someone who had no idea what they were talking about, but whose confidence was large enough to fill the gap. She thought about 22 years. She thought about the salary that had been adjusted once in 2011. She thought about the specific arithmetic of what the Holts had received and what they had given. And she did not do this with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed precision of an economist. Which was what she was, regardless of what they had seen when they looked at her. The certification arrived on a Thursday. Philip called her at 11 in the morning. "It's confirmed," he said. 2.4 carats, old European cut, V's 1 clarity, I color. The grader's note says it's one of the finest examples of that period they've evaluated in recent years. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where he had made tea. The same table where she had set the ring between them. She said, "What does that number mean in today's market?" he told her. She sat with the number for a moment. Then she said, "Philip, what was it worth in today's market when they put it in storage?" He said, "Probably similar. A stone like this doesn't depreciate." "It may have appreciated," she said, "so they stored it." "Yes, for years. Based on the surface condition, I'd estimate at least 15 years in storage. Maybe more. And they gave it to me," she said, "because they thought it was worthless." He was quiet. She said, "They looked at it and they saw what they expected to see. And they gave it to me because they thought I would see the same thing." He said, "Yes." She sat at the table for a while. Then she said, "I need to think about what to do." Philip said, "I know," she said, "I'll tell you tonight." She put the phone down. She sat with her tea and the morning and the specific weight of a number that had just changed the shape of what she was holding in her right hand. She was 61 years old. She had a degree in economics. She had a husband who could read the truth of things. She had 22 years in a house where nobody had thought to ask what she was, and she had a ring that nobody had thought to look at. And in both cases, the answer had been there all along, waiting for someone to find it. She picked up her phone. She called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Celestine Barclay. She was 44 years old and had been practicing estate and property law in Savannah for 16 years. Adiz had known her for 3. They attended the same church, sat in adjacent pews on the first Sunday of each month, and had spoken at length at enough post-service lunches that Celestine understood, without needing a formal briefing, the kind of person she was talking to. She listened to Adiz's account for 20 minutes without interrupting. When Adiz finished, Celestine said, "Do you have the certification? Philip is sending it. And you have documentation of the gift, something in writing." Margaret sent a note with the box. Handwritten, it says. Adiz took the note from her bag. She had kept it. She kept everything. It says, "For Adiz, with our gratitude for your years of service. This ring belonged to Charles's mother and we believe you should have it," signed by both of them. Celestine looked at the note. She said they signed it. "Yes, both of them. Yes." Celestine looked at the certification. She looked at the note. She looked at Adiz. She said, "I want to be precise with you about what this means legally because the situation is specific." "Please," Adiz said. "A gift, given voluntarily with documentation, is a gift. It transfers ownership at the moment of giving. The motivation for the gift, the belief that it had little value, doesn't change the legal transfer. They gave it. You received it. The certification of its actual value doesn't alter the ownership." Adiz said, "So it's mine." "It was yours the moment she set the box on the table." "Yes." Adiz looked at the certification. She said, "I assumed as much. I needed to hear it." Celestine said, "What are you going to do?" Adiz was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm going to tell them." Celestine looked at her. Adiz said, "They should know what they had, what they gave away. Not for my benefit, they should simply know. Because the truth is the truth regardless of whether it benefits me." Celestine said, "You don't have to." "I know," Adiz said. "But I'm going to. If you need to see what happened when she told them, subscribe." Because the conversation in the Holt kitchen on a Friday afternoon, is not the conversation Margaret Holt had been expecting when Adiz knocked on the door, and it is not something that left any of the people in that room unchanged. She knocked at 2 in the afternoon. Margaret opened the door. She looked at Adiz with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected to see her. The relationship had, in her mind, concluded with the velvet box, and then composed herself into the expression of a woman receiving a visitor. "Adiz," she said, "come in." They sat in the kitchen. Margaret offered tea, the specific reflex of a woman who managed things through hospitality. Adiz said yes. While the water boiled, Adiz placed 2 documents on the table. The first was the third-party certification. The second was Margaret's handwritten note. Margaret looked at the documents. She looked at the ring on Adiz's right hand. She looked at the certification. She read it. Her face moved through several expressions in sequence: confusion, then the beginning of something that might have been comprehension, then a specific, contracting expression that Adiz recognized as the face of someone receiving information they had not anticipated and do not yet know what to do with. "I don't understand," Margaret said. "Charles's mother always said she said it was just a piece she'd had for years, nothing special." "She may not have known," Adiz said. "Or she may have known and not said. I can't speak to that. This says," Margaret looked at the certification again, "this says it's worth." "Yes." Margaret set the certification down. She looked at Adiz. She said, "We didn't know." "I believe you," Adiz said. "That's why I'm telling you." "Why are you telling us?" Adiz looked at her. She said, "Because you should know what you had and what you gave. And perhaps, going forward, you should know that the value of a thing and the appearance of a thing are not always the same." Margaret looked at the table. Adiz said, "I want to be clear about something else." Margaret looked up. "The ring is mine. You gave it to me. Your note is signed by both of you. I've consulted a lawyer. The gift is legal and complete." She paused. "I'm not here to return it. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because I believe the truth should be said aloud in the room where it belongs." Margaret was very still. Adiz said, "I worked in your house for 22 years. I cooked your meals. I was present for your children's illnesses and your celebrations and your ordinary Tuesdays. I received a salary that was adjusted once in 22 years. I received this ring as a parting gift because you believed it had little value." She looked at the certification. "It does not have little value." She stood up. She said, "I have a degree in economics from the University of Ghana. My husband has spent 34 years evaluating gemstones on Montgomery Street. We have been in this city for 34 years. You have driven past his shop." She paused. "You never asked." She picked up the certification. She left the note on the table, Margaret's own words, in Margaret's own handwriting, the document that said, "We believe you should have it." And that was true. And that Adiz was choosing to leave as a record of the thing that had been said. She walked out of the Holt kitchen for the last time. She walked home. Charles Holt called Philip's shop the following week. Philip answered the phone the way he answered all calls, with his name, his shop's name, and the quiet patience of a man who had been in business for 30 years and had learned that every call was a person who needed something true. Charles said, "I'd like to speak with you about the ring." Philip said, "All right." Charles came to the shop on a Wednesday. He was 63 years old. He sat across from Philip at the workbench, and he looked at his hands for a moment before he spoke. He said, "I owe your wife an apology." Philip said, "Yes." Charles said, "More than one." Philip said, "Yes." Charles said, "I don't know how to. I'm not sure what to say that would be adequate." Philip looked at him. He looked at him the way he looked at everything that came to his workbench, with the first assessment before the instruments, the reading of the actual thing underneath the presented surface. What he saw was a man who was not performing contrition, who was sitting in genuine, uncomfortable contact with something he had not previously looked at, and was now looking at, and did not know what to do with. Philip said, "You don't need to say anything to me." Charles said, "She won't take my calls." "No," Philip said, "she won't." "Is there?" "No," Philip said. "There is no action you can take now that repairs 22 years. That's not how time works." Charles was quiet. Philip said, "What you can do, and I say this not for her benefit but because it's true, is apply the lesson to the people who work for you now. To the way you look at people whose names you know but whose lives you don't." Charles looked at the workbench. Philip said, "The ring is my wife's. It will remain my wife's." "If there's nothing else," Charles stood. He straightened his jacket. He was the kind of man whose posture was his dignity, and his posture was not quite as certain as it had always been. He said, "Your shop has been here for 30 years. 34, Philip said. "I've driven past it many times." "Yes." Charles looked at the door, then he looked at Philip. He said, "I should have come in." Philip said, "Yes." Charles left. Philip sat at his workbench for a moment after the door closed. Then he picked up the ring he had been working on when Charles arrived, a client's piece, a broken prong that needed resetting, and he went back to work. The ring sold at auction 14 months later. Not because Adiz needed the money, though the money was significant and changed the arithmetic of their retirement in ways that were real and welcome. She sold it because Philip had suggested it, gently, one evening over tea, that the ring's value was in what it had revealed, not in what it was, and that keeping it on her finger was keeping the Holts on her finger, and she might consider whether she wanted that. She had thought about it for 3 weeks. Then she had said, "You're right." She had taken it to a reputable auction house in Atlanta, not the largest, but the one whose specialists Philip trusted, whose catalog descriptions were honest, whose hammer prices reflected actual market. The auctioneer had called Philip the week before the sale to ask about provenance. Philip had given the full history, the age, the cut, the certification, the story of how it had come to them. The auctioneer had said, "May I include the provenance in the catalog notes? Buyers respond to the history of a piece." Philip had thought about it. He had said, "Include what is factually accurate." The ring was part of a Georgia family's estate. It was gifted after years in storage. Its true nature was unknown to the family at the time of the gift. The auctioneer said, "That's a remarkable story," Philip said. "It's a true one." The ring sold on a Saturday evening in October. The buyer was a collector in Charleston who specialized in early 20th century estate jewelry and who had identified the piece, from the catalog photograph alone, as one of the finest examples of an old European cut diamond he had seen at auction in a decade. The hammer came down. Philip called Adiz immediately. She was in the garden. It was October in Savannah, and the garden was doing what gardens did in October, preparing, slowly, for the winter, everything going quiet by degrees. She answered. He told her the number. She stood in the garden with the phone in her hand and looked at the plants going quiet around her. She said, "Philip," he said. "Yes," she said. She said it wasn't worth much. He said, "I know," she said. She said it was just a piece she'd had for years. "Nothing special." He said, "I know." She stood in the garden. She said, "She was wrong." He said, "Yes." She looked at her right hand where the ring had been. The skin there was different, lighter, a thin line where the band had rested. She said, "I'm going to plant something here." He said, "In the garden. Something that takes a long time to grow," she said. "Something that looks like nothing for a while and then becomes what it always was." He said, "That sounds right." She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the garden in the October light, which was the specific light of that latitude and that season, warm and thin and particular. The light that made everything it touched look like it was being seen clearly for the first time. She thought about Margaret Holt setting the velvet box on the table, about the word she had used. Worthless. She had not said it exactly, but it had been in the shape of what she said, the framework of it. The framework had been wrong. The framework was very often wrong. She had spent 22 years knowing this, in the specific, patient way of a person who knows something that the room around them does not, and who has decided, for reasons of practicality and peace, not to make the knowing into a performance. She had not needed to. The truth had surfaced on its own, under the loupe, in the refractometer, in a number from a third-party grading institution. In a hammer that fell on a Saturday evening in October. The truth had been there the whole time. It had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to look. She planted a camellia. In the corner of the garden where the light was best, in October, when the ground was still warm enough to receive it. Camellias took years to establish, 3, 4, sometimes 5 before they showed you what they were going to be. They looked like nothing in the first year, just a green thing, present and quiet. She planted it on a Sunday in the morning while Philip made tea inside. She patted the earth around the base. She watered it. She stood up and looked at it for a moment. Her granddaughter Maya, 7 years old, was watching from the garden path. Maya said, "What is it?" "A camellia," Adiz said. "What does it look like when it grows?" Adiz looked at the small green thing in the ground. She said, "It looks like what it always was. You just have to wait for it to show you." Maya thought about this. She said, "How long?" "A few years," Adiz said. Maya looked at the plant. She said, "I'll remember to look." Adiz looked at her granddaughter. She said, "Good." She picked up the trowel. She went back to work. There is a kind of value that does not announce itself. It sits in a velvet box in a drawer in a study that nobody opens anymore. It is stored for 15 years because nobody thought to look at it. It is given away because the person giving it has already decided what it is, and their decision is so complete that they do not reach for the loupe. Do not ask the question. Do not pause long enough to consider that the appearance of a thing and the nature of a thing might be different. The same thing happens with people. We store them, we give them away. We hand them velvet boxes of the relationship we've decided they deserve, and we feel good about the gesture. And we do not ask what they actually are, or what they have actually given, or what we have actually received. The stone was always a diamond. Adiz was always an economist, Philip's wife, a grandmother who plants camellias. A woman with a degree, a history, a life that had been fully itself every single Tuesday morning in a kitchen where nobody asked. The truth does not require your acknowledgement. It simply is. And it has a way of surfacing, under a loupe in a certification. In a hammer that falls on a Saturday evening. That does not ask permission from the people who spent 15 years deciding it wasn't there. Here is the question this story leaves behind. Who have you stored in a drawer, not with cruelty, but with the comfortable blindness of someone who has never needed to look, whose actual value you have never thought to find out? And what would change if you did? If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe, stay close. The next one is coming, and it starts the same way. With someone being given something that the giver thinks is worthless, and ending the same way, with the truth arriving in whatever form it takes, patient, uncorrupted, exactly what it always was. Drop a comment. Tell me, who in your life has been underestimated by the world, by the room, by the people around them, and turned out to be exactly what they always were, which was extraordinary? Let them be seen, even here, even now, because everybody deserves to be seen.